It is my pleasure now to introduce a colleague and friend and one of the people who helped organize the symposium, Sander Vandula, who's the director of the School of Human Evolution and Social Change, and he'll introduce the first speaker.
Look, you're not here to hear me, you're here to hear scientists and famous scientists. I'm going to be very, very brief and simply give you an overview of an exemplary career that has led Steven Pinker, among other things, to accept the invitation to be here. I'm going back a couple of years when, in a much more restrained circle, we had actually here at ASU two of the people who started the discipline that he is now probably the most well-known person of, and that is John Tooby and Leda Cosmides. That really interested a number of us because it poses a very interesting question, and that is about human evolution. Is that a question of predetermining only in a very general sense our structure, or is it something in which not only our physical capabilities but also some of our more ungraspable capabilities are part of that evolutionary trajectory? Now, Pinker was born in Canada and graduated first from Dawson College in Montreal. He then went on to McGill and finally earned his doctorate at Harvard in experimental psychology. Did research at MIT for some time and then became an assistant professor at Harvard and then Stanford. From 1982 till 2003, he taught at the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences at MIT again, and eventually became the director for the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience. Right now, since 2008, he is the Johnstone Family Professor of Psychology at Harvard. Now, just to give you a little flavor of the many other things that I could cite, Pinker was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world in 2004. He has received honorary doctorates from about 8 or 9 universities I can see, and was twice a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And that is something I want to accentuate. Pinker is somebody who has not only kept science for the scientists, but he has actually made science accessible in a number of very successful books. For example, The Language Instinct in '94, How the Mind Works in '97, and most recently, The Stuff of Thought in 2007. He has had many awards for those books and has been on the New York Times bestseller list on a number of occasions. Now, one audacious spirit who wrote about Pinker in Wikipedia compared his idea to a Swiss Army knife that has particular tools that are meant to deal with problems faced by our Pleistocene ancestors. He's been very controversial about that. There clearly is a sense in which the functions humans fulfill, and not only the physical functions, are long-term evolutionary things. The question is, did that arise? How did that arise? And why did that arise? I'm not going to say much more. I just want to welcome Steve Pinker and thank him for his presentation on the cognitive niche.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be addressing you today at this wonderful conference, and I thank Lawrence Krauss and all of the other people who made this event possible. As many of you know, this year is the bicentennial of the birth of Charles Darwin and the sesquicentennial of the publication of The Origin of Species, which introduced the world to the concept of evolution by natural selection. But Darwin was, of course, not the sole inventor of the theory of natural selection. Credit also goes to Alfred Russel Wallace, who independently came up with the idea. But Darwin and Wallace, though they agreed on much, had a rather testy disagreement on one corollary of the theory of natural selection, namely whether it could account for the evolution of human intelligence. And Wallace posed a problem that led to this disagreement, which is still with us today. Wallace wrote, "Our law, our government, and our science continually require us to reason through a variety of complicated phenomena to the expected result. Even our games, such as chess, compel us to exercise all these faculties in a remarkable degree. A brain one half larger than that of the gorilla would fully have sufficed for the limited mental development of the savage, and we must therefore admit that the large brain he actually possesses could never have been solely developed by any of those laws of evolution, whose essence is that they lead to a degree of organization exactly proportionate to the wants of each species, never beyond those wants. Natural selection could only have endowed savage man with a brain a few degrees superior to that of an ape, whereas he actually possesses one very little inferior to that of a philosopher." And Wallace concluded, "A superior intelligence has guided the development of man in a definite direction and for a special purpose." In other words, Wallace was not only one of the two originators of the theory of natural selection, but also a proponent of the theory of intelligent design when it came to the human brain. So this is a puzzle for human evolution, namely, why are humans so smart? And I'll propose an answer that is closer to the spirit of Darwin himself than to Wallace's explanation. Namely, that humans evolved to fill the cognitive niche, that is, manipulating the environment through causal reasoning and social cooperation, and that a process of metaphorical abstraction allowed cognitive mechanisms that were adapted to physical reasoning to be applied to abstract domains. And I'll now expand both of those propositions. The cognitive niche is a term that comes from the anthropologists John Tooby and Irv DeVore in an article on synthesizing human evolution. And they begin with the observation that organisms evolve at each other's expense. Every bit of food that an organism consumes is a body part of some other organism, which would just as soon keep that body part to itself. The result is that organisms develop defenses against being eaten. Animals develop shells and horns and fangs and claws and so on. And plants can't very well defend themselves through their behavior, so they resort to chemical warfare. And most plants are filled with toxins and irritants and bitter-tasting substances to deter the likes of us that have designs on their flesh. The better defenses in evolution set up a selective pressure for better weapons, which set up a pressure for better defenses, and so on in a coevolutionary arms race. This arms race is played out in evolutionary time. The cognitive niche is an opportunity in ecosystems that seems to have been filled by early humans. The idea is that humans overtake other organisms' fixed defenses via cause and effect reasoning, that is, mental models and cognitive tools that allow people to anticipate the effects of manipulations of the world, and thereby to develop tools and traps and snares, extracting a poison from one organism and using it to do in another, ways of detoxifying plants by soaking, boiling, cooking, fermenting, and so on, the use of drugs to treat illnesses, and many other sophisticated technologies that one can see in human populations all over the world, including those of hunter-gatherers before independent of the advent of civilization and agriculture. Also, the cognitive niche involves cooperative action, the negotiating of agreements among actors so that they can accomplish collectively what could not be accomplished by individual actors acting alone. This includes both the exchange of favors, one of them joining another in a fight, or babysitting for their kids, or lending food to be repaid at a later time, and also coordinated action, such as fanning out over a landscape to drive game into a concentrated area where they can be dispatched, something that a single person acting alone could never accomplish. Now, these tactics are played out in real time, that is, using brain power. Humans can figure out how to crack the defenses of other organisms, and the other organisms, however, can only defend themselves in evolutionary time. The result is that humans, for a long time, have perpetrated mass extinctions whenever they move into an area. The local flora and fauna drop like flies, unable to keep up in their evolutionary pace with humans cracking their defenses in real time. This leads to, I think, a rather apt characterization of our species from the journalist Ambrose Bierce in his Devil's Dictionary, which defines our species as follows. Man, noun, an animal so lost in rapturous contemplation of what he thinks he is as to overlook what he indubitably ought to be. His chief occupation is extermination of other animals and his own species, which, however, multiplies with such insistent rapidity as to infest the whole habitable earth and Canada. Now, as a Canadian, I find this highly offensive. But I do think that he has our species number. Now, I think the theory of the cognitive niche can explain many of the zoologically unusual features of Homo sapiens, traits that are unique or at least hyperdeveloped in our species. Firstly, technological know-how, the ability to put together complex tools to process plants and meats in extended sequences to develop drugs. Secondly, cooperation among non-kin, which many anthropologists and biologists have noted is extremely rare in the animal kingdom, but highly developed among humans. And it's also been noted that cooperation among non-kin makes high demands on the information processing abilities of the cooperators, including recognition of individuals, episodic memory for past actions, who did what to me and indeed to other people, and a suite of moral emotions such as sympathy, gratitude, anger, guilt, and trust that allow the exchange of favors and the mutual benefit to take place in the face of the constant temptation of one of the parties to cheat or renege on an agreement. Cooperation can only be stable if the cooperators possess this suite of psychological capacities. A third feature of the cognitive niche, which is unique among humans, is grammatical language, the ability to order symbols in such a way that the meaning of the combination can be computed from the meanings of the individual words and the way that they're arranged, and by that manner, convey information about who did what to whom and about what is where. Grammatical language, of course, allows us to share our expertise so that we don't have to recapitulate the trial and error or strokes of genius or lucky accidents that resulted in the acquisition of some technology, and also to negotiate social contracts. With the use of language, we can promise a favor in the future for a favor received now. We can also exchange not just physical objects like hunks of meat, but knowledge and promises to do favors in the future. Grammatical language allows an unlimited number of bargains to be struck or information to be exchanged because grammar is a combinatorial system. As a result, the number of possible sentences, and hence the number of shareable thoughts that can be conveyed through language, is approximately equal to the number of words on average that are possible in a position in a sentence, raised to the power of the length of a sentence. For example, if there are 4,000 nouns with which to begin a sentence and 1,000 verbs with which to continue it, you have 1 million ways of beginning a sentence, 4 million ways of beginning a sentence, and you're only 2 words into it. The number of possibilities explodes from there. There are a number of other unusual features of Homo sapiens that are part of this complex. Humans inhabit every habitat in the world, including Canada. Rather than being narrowly adapted to the desert or the forest or the savanna, humans infest the entire globe. Humans are extreme omnivores, and unusually for primates, we depend on meat. We have unusual childhoods. The humans spend most of their life either being children or bringing up children, which can be seen as a kind of extended apprenticeship to be a fully functioning human. There's a lot that you have to learn. You are not equipped innately with all of the wherewithal necessary to survive, and so our extended childhoods are a way of preparing the child with all of the acquired information that's necessary to be a functioning human. As a result of presumably of our long period of childhood dependence, we have biparental care, also unusual among mammals, where the trade-off among men between seeking out mating opportunities and ensuring the survival of their own vulnerable children is tilted more in the direction of helping their children than you see in a typical mammal. But because of this trade-off and the other factors that are associated with bringing up children, we have a complex pattern of sexuality with a number of options among societies, and long-term mating, that is man and woman staying together for long periods of time. And of course, division into cultures. There isn't a single human lifestyle, but because both the accumulated know-how is local to a group of people sharing information, and because the means of coordinating behavior are particular to a group, different groups will, over the course of cultural history, evolve different ways, resulting in what we call different societies or cultures. Well, a question is, given the obvious advantages of outsmarting other plants and animals in real time rather than out-evolving them in evolutionary time, why didn't all organisms enter the cognitive niche? Or why didn't at least more organisms? Why was it us? What was so special about ape-like ancestor that would take us down the path that we find ourselves at the end of today? We know that contrary to probably the most common misconception of the evolutionary process, intelligence is not a general goal of evolution. The idea that evolution naturally pushes organisms in the direction of humans, which sit at some pinnacle of evolution, is just a misunderstanding of how natural selection works. And so expressions like, I don't want to date him, he's not very evolved, or the bumper sticker that I saw that said, "Oh, evolve," represent an idea of evolution as a kind of intellectual or moral progress, but this has nothing to do with the actual mechanism of natural selection. The obvious reason that not everyone joined us in the cognitive niche is that as much as intelligence brings advantages, it also has a number of disadvantages. Having this big processing unit, this enormous brain balancing on top of our necks, brings a number of expenses, including the cost of stoking it. The brain occupies 2% of our body mass, but consumes 10% of our glucose and 10% of our oxygen, 20% of our glucose and oxygen. The big head comprises a risk of death in childbirth to women, and compromises in the design of the pelvis, which in both sexes is wider than would be optimal on biomechanical grounds, and vulnerable to accidents and disease. With this big bobblehead balanced on top of a vertical body, it's almost a recipe for disaster, and with falls or blows leaving us liable to brain damage or death. So the question is, what would shift the cost-benefit ratio so that the advantages of being smart outweigh the disadvantages of a big brain? And we don't know the answer, but I think there are a number of plausible and testable hypotheses. One of them is prehensile hands combined with bipedality. And Donald Johanson will tell us that indeed upright posture long preceded the expansion of the human brain in the paleoanthropological record. If you have hands, then you have a way of translating your intelligence into tools and technologies. So it's not that we think intelligent thoughts, but with hands we can do something about them. The fact that we don't have to walk on our hands all the time means that we can actually carry things, the fruits of our technology. Meat eating is another plausible precondition, not only because meat provides the nutrients that are necessary to stoke a voracious big brain, but working in the other direction, it takes more brain power to subdue an antelope than to subdue broccoli or and probably group living was a precondition for entry into the cognitive niche, both because there are demands to surviving in a group that depends on cooperation, the cognitive demands that I mentioned earlier, and because living in a group allows one to accumulate expertise and therefore multiplies its benefit. And group living, we have reason to believe, was plausibly in place in human evolution before the expansion of the human brain. Now, I think a crucial ingredient of this theory is that language, know-how, and sociality co-evolved, each of them being a primary selection pressure for the other two. Language by its very design, allows the transmission of structured information. That's why we have grammatical rules with systematic meanings. And a crucial property of information as a commodity that can be exchanged among intelligent agents is that it can be duplicated without loss. It's what economists sometimes call a non-rival good. With hunks of matter, rival goods, once they are transmitted, they are thereby relinquished. If I give you a fish, I no longer have the fish, or as in the cliche, you can't have your cake and eat it. But if I teach you how to fish, it's not as if I no longer know how to fish by virtue of having shared the information with you. I've made a copy of it, and both of us can benefit. The distinction between informational goods and non-informational goods is very much with us today as we struggle with how to adapt laws that were originally designed for the transfer of loaves of bread and pieces of land and tools and other non-rival goods to the new commodity of information, and hence you have all of the conflicts about what to do with books that are downloaded from Google or music that is shared among peers, where the people doing the downloading and sharing say, well, just because I have made a copy of it, it's not as if I have stolen anything tangible from you. Now, language, because it trades in this non-rival good that can be duplicated without loss, multiplies the benefit of know-how. It lowers the cost of acquisition, so I don't have to recapitulate the steps leading to the discovery of some technique, but can just tell you how to do it, or I can learn it from others. And once it's acquired, if I figure out some new way of extracting a poison or snaring an animal, it's not just useful to me and my kin in terms of the marginally greater number of rabbits that I can catch, but I have something that is useful to other people. I have a trade good that I can exchange for something in return. And indeed, information is the ultimate commodity that facilitates reciprocal altruism or gains in trade, because it is the thing that is best suited to bringing a high benefit to others at a low cost to the self, which is the main precondition for the evolution of reciprocal altruism. Namely, with a few seconds and a bit of breath, I can confer an enormous benefit on someone else at a trivial cost to myself, and vice versa. Now, language, though, requires social cooperation, as we see in the idiom to be on speaking terms. You have to be willing to cooperate with someone in the first place for language to be possible. But it also facilitates cooperation, because what you can trade is not just physical goods, but favors, the promise to do something in the future in exchange for a benefit taken today. And it allows not just the immediate exchange of favors or goods, but the ones that are widely separated in time. And because circumstances change, you may not need a favor now, but could be in a position of needing one later. You might have a benefit to confer at a later time that you don't have now. The gains in trade that make reciprocity possible are multiplied when language serves as a means of binding agreements that involve exchange of favors separated in time. So the hypothesis is that language, know-how, and sociality were the principal selection pressures for one another, and that triad, it was a particularly potent complex of adaptations that defines the cognitive niche. Well, part two of the solution to Wallace's problem has to answer the question of how cognitive mechanisms that were selected for physical and social reasoning enabled Homo sapiens to engage in abstract reasoning. If you buy the theory so far, it is not a mystery that humans at all levels of technological development live by their wits and develop complex technologies for surviving in an environment, but that still doesn't explain why we're so good at physics and law and chess and so on. I think there is a clue from language, namely the process of metaphorical abstraction, a linguistic phenomenon first documented by Jeffrey Gruber and elaborated in different ways by the linguists Ray Jackendoff, George Lakoff, and Len Talmy. And here's the phenomenon. Language is just saturated with metaphors that we use without even realizing that they're metaphorical. Take a verb of movement, like to go, and prepositions like from and to. I can say the messenger went from Paris to Istanbul, expressing a motion in space. I can also say the inheritance went to Fred, where the transfer now is in the metaphorical realm of possession rather than in the physical realm of motion. Nothing need to have changed position in space. The inheritance could have been a house or a piece of land. I can say the light went from green to red, where now the motion is in a kind of state space, where again the traffic light was embedded in concrete. It didn't go anywhere physically. I can say the meeting went from 3 to 4, where I'm using space as a metaphor for time. We also see throughout language the use of force as a metaphor. I can say Rose forced the door to open, which describes the application of physical force. I can also say Rose forced Sadie to go. That doesn't mean that she manhandled her, but rather coerced her with verbal or psychological pressure. I can even say Rose forced herself to go, the application of intrapersonal force, as if there were two little actors inside Rose's brain that were engaged in a tug of war. Now, I think it's not a coincidence that we see space and force in so many guises in language. They're not just a kind of ornament or aesthetic flourish, but they are mechanisms with which we can reason. The position in space acts in many ways like the value of a variable in mathematics, and it supports propositional inferences. If A moves from X to Y, if I know that, I can now infer that it is now at Y, but wasn't at Y at some point in the past. Similarly, if A is given by John to Mary, it is now owned by Mary, but was not owned by her at some time in the past. So the same logical inferences that follow from spatial models can be transferred and with them bring some inferential power in the domain of possession. Likewise, force behaves in many ways like causation, in particular in supporting counterfactual inferences. If A forces B to move to Y, then I can infer that if A hadn't forced it, B would still be at X. Compare, if John forced Mary to be polite to Sam, then if John hadn't forced her, she would not have been polite, in both cases, all else being equal. So again, force as a domain of understanding supports certain inferential rules. Is this on now? Yes. Okay. Supports certain inferential rules that can be carried over to more abstract domains. Louder? Okay. And the value of a variable, which is something that we can co-opt from spatial reasoning, and causation of change, which we can co-opt from force dynamic reasoning, are the basic elements of scientific thinking. That's what science is largely about, values of variables and how they change over time. And so applying the metaphor of position in space and the metaphor of force applied over time supply us with the basic building blocks that are refined in scientific theorizing. Now, metaphors also can be combined. Just as language itself is a combinatorial system of putting nouns and verbs together into phrases and sentences, that allows us to take simple metaphors and combine them into more complex ones, such as, for example, the container metaphor of communication, a mental model that underlies many tropes that we use to talk about communicating, in which the underlying model is that ideas are objects, sentences are containers, and communicating is sending. As when we say, we gather our ideas to put them into words, and if our verbiage is not empty or hollow, we might get these ideas across to a listener who can unpack our words to extract their content, all of them elaborations of this central metaphor. Well, this is a kind of evidence that comes from the structure of the English language, and one can ask the question, does it really correspond to a pervasive cognitive process, or are we just seeing the accumulated record of flashes of insight by wordsmiths lost in the mists of history, which happen only rarely and can't really be attributed as an everyday cognitive process in the vast majority of us? Well, there are a couple of sources of evidence that suggest that this analogical abstraction or metaphorical abstraction is a psychologically active process. One of my favorites comes from a phenomenon documented by the psychologist Melissa Bowerman of a certain kind of errors that children spontaneously make in their speech, such as, I putted part of the sleeve blue, so I crossed it out with red, where the child is using the verb put, which in the adult language applies only to a change of location, and is here using it to describe a change of state from blue to red. The fact that it sounds unmistakably childlike to us shows that this is an act of creation by the child. The child discerned the abstract similarity between change of location and change of state, and which inspired that particular error. Another example, can I have any reading behind the dinner, meaning before the dinner, where the child spontaneously noted the parallel between space and time? And my dolly is scrunched from someone, but not from me. Again, we know what that means, but we wouldn't use the preposition from in that sense. The child here is using a preposition that ordinarily refers to the source of motion and using it for the source of causation. There's another phenomenon that shows the psychological vitality of the process of metaphorical abstraction, and it's a kind of reminding phenomenon, first documented by Roger Schenck and Douglas Hofstadter independently. The paradigm case, the first report in the literature, came from Roger Schenck, the computer scientist, who was having his hair cut and was annoyed that he had told the barber to cut it short, and the barber hadn't cut it as short as he wanted. And he immediately thought of a time when he asked his wife to cook his steak well done, and she hadn't cooked it as well done as he wanted. Now, this is a rather odd instance of reminding. it is very much unlike the prototypical kind of reminding made famous by Marcel Proust, in which the taste of a Madeleine biscuit soaked in lime blossom tea time transported him back to an episode in childhood in which he had experienced the same taste and smell. In this case, there is nothing similar between the shortness of hair and the well-doneness of steak, or in any of the sensory experiences that accompany them. The parallel is purely analogical, something like A requests B to bring some object C up to some state D, and then is frustrated that A did not meet that criterion. Now, this is quite extraordinary if it is a way in which human thoughts are organized so that one will activate the other based on that abstract underlying structure that they have in common. I'll give you a couple of other examples from my own experience. I was at a folk music performance when I was a student, and the singer had laryngitis, and she really should not have been performing at all, but I guess she needed the money, and she croaked her way through a very painful first set. Everyone was feeling rather cross and frustrated. She went off for the intermission, came back, and as she resumed, her voice sounded okay, and there was kind of a sigh of relief through the audience. And my friend leaned over and he said, well, you know that when you have a dried out felt pen and you put the cap back on for a little while, it will write again, but then it runs out of ink very quickly. Again, quite a recondite thread of similarity between the reminding event and the thing that it reminded him of. A third example, I play around a lot in Photoshop, fiddling with photographs, and at one point there was an area of the picture that was a little too bright, so I burned it in and made it darker, but then it was too dark, so I had to darken the next area next to it to even it out. But then there was a big dark blob in 2/3 of the picture, so I had to darken yet another area. And it reminded me of how when you have a uneven, wobbly table, you can saw off a bit from one leg, but then that only makes it, introduces another wobble, and so on. Well, what these have in common is a highly abstract structure that spontaneously links one thought to another. And if this is a common process, it would be the crucial cognitive process that would allow the mental structures that plausibly could have been adapted to cause and effect reasoning in the physical world to be co-opted for abstract reasoning in scientific and legal and social and religious domains. So we were I was very excited about this, and I kept a reminding diary just to see how often I had Proustian remindings where the common thread was sensory experience versus analogical remindings when it was abstract structure. And I found by just writing down every time one thing reminded me of another that about 1/3 of my remindings were abstract. James Lee, a graduate student at Harvard, and I then recruited a number of people to keep their own reminding diaries and to just keep a pad, and every time one thing reminded them of another, just to write it down. And they then sent them in to us when they had accumulated 12 of them. Well, we analyzed these and found that the modal number of analogical remindings from about 25 subjects was 0. To our surprise, that the typical reminding was, I was in a store and they were playing a song and it reminded me of the last time that I heard that song. Well, that's kind of disappointing. And we had to ask, what is it about Roger Schenck, Douglas Hofstadter, and I that made so many more of our remindings seemingly abstract? And you hate to come to the conclusion that there is something psychologically peculiar about the investigator. But there is a more plausible common denominator, not that the minds of Roger Schenck, Douglas Hofstadter, and I work differently, but that we are in the business of cognitive psychology. We are attentive to the very possibility that two thoughts might be linked by abstract structure. Abstract structure is a kind of lingo or concept that cognitive psychologists deal with for a living, but that may not occur to people. And the possibility, therefore, was that people do have these remindings, but they strike them as non sequiturs and not as remindings at all, since they don't have the metacognitive category of an analogy or an abstract similarity. And so that the phenomenon occurs all the time, but that most people just don't notice them when they happen. And by just giving people a couple of examples of remindings, both analogical and non-analogical, saying these are the kind of remindings that people sometimes happen. And we got a new group of subjects to both keep reminding diaries and in a more structured experiment to write down any remindings that occurred to them as they read a set of short stories that we presented. We found that about 16% of reminding episodes are analogical. So this does seem to be a process that occurs to people in general, although they may not notice them as they flit by. Anyway, this gives us at least some confidence that analogical reminding might be the psychological process behind the creation and extension of grammatical metaphors, and more generally behind the co-option of concrete schemas of thought and reasoning to more abstract domains. There are a number of ways in which the ideas that I have presented so far this morning could be tested. One would be comparative studies. If you go back to the hypotheses about the possible preconditions to entering the cognitive niche, James Lee, the graduate student that did the reminding study, has also combed the literature on animal intelligence and has found that there are a number of behavioral tasks given to animals that in many ways are analogous to human IQ tests, and in fact that are rather good measures of G, or general intelligence. And by correlating performance of animals in these experimental tasks with features of their ecology, Lee argued that G is fostered when in carnivorous animals, it's correlated at least with extended childhoods or juvenile stages in animals, with group living and with brain size, a kind of at least correlational support for the idea that group living, carnivory, large brain, and extended juvenile periods all form a cohesive niche. It will be possible in the future to do genetic studies. Analogical reminding is, we suspect, highly related to G. The subtests in an IQ test that are best index general intelligence are things like analogies. An egg is to a bird as a seed is to such and such, where the correct answer depends on abstracting from sensory experiences and to discern logical structure. We know that G is highly heritable. It's possible that in the future, large studies correlating genotypes and phenotypes may find genes associated with G, and there are statistical techniques that can discern the signatures of natural selection on candidate genes. They can be applied should any genes be discovered that correlate with G. So to sum up, I have suggested that human intelligence arose as an adaptation to the cognitive niche, which may be defined as the use of cause and effect reasoning to defeat the fixed defenses of other organisms, and the development of psychological adaptations to coordinate behavior with other humans. That know-how, language, and sociality co-evolved as adaptations to this niche, that this helps explain other zoologically unusual features of Homo sapiens, and that a process of metaphorical abstraction via analogical reminding allowed concrete intelligence to be applied to abstract domains, supporting inference in those domains. And so 150 years later, we can appreciate the contributions of Darwin and Wallace, but we have reason to suspect that when it came to the evolution of human intelligence, Darwin was closer to the truth than Wallace. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I don't know. Can you hear? Yeah. Thank you, Stephen, for a wonderfully concise and yet intriguing expose about how these qualities of human uniqueness came about. Now, I have a hard time looking in the distance, but I have been given 5 or 7 minutes for you to ask some questions and for Stephen to try and answer them. So if you can sort of very quickly put up your hand.
Okay. Did you consider when you were conducting your second round of examinations on analogical remembrances that was really experiment or error involved?
Well, by experiment or error, do you mean in suggesting to people remindings that may not have happened? Yes, we are worried about that, and we're doing a number just to make sure that people weren't post hoc searching for any analogy that they could find. So we're having a number of controls for that. One of them is just asking people to what extent did these occur to you spontaneously, or did you actively search for them to see if that changes the ratio? Another is which we plan to do in the future, is to put them under a bit of more time pressure so that they don't have time to actively search for possible analogies. Anyway, there are a couple of other measures that we plan to take.
Yes, I have a question regarding the Wallace theory, and that it was involved in intelligent design. And given Ben Stein's interest in that whole area and the satire that he did, I'm just wondering if any particular point in time that there were some efforts to move into intelligent design and in a scientific way, and just your thoughts on the whole thing with whether or not this whole topic has been neglected by the scientific community.
Yeah, I don't think it's been neglected, in the sense that if anyone came up with a fully developed causal model that incorporated the assumptions of intelligent design, that made some kind of testable prediction, that would be a niche that would be irresistible to fill. If someone could show that there was some feature of human brain or human intelligence that could be best explained by some intelligent entity, then that person would win a Nobel Prize and be the belle of the ball scientifically. The thing is that no one can come up with any kind of evidence or test or phenomenon that shows signs of the handiwork of some intelligent designer. There's been no need, no phenomenon whatsoever that supports that idea, and many that contradict it. The fact that if one were to try to pin down what an intelligent designer would want to intelligently design, such as some degree of maximal cooperation, moral sense, wisdom, foresight, then you look at Homo sapiens and it seems rather badly designed by those criteria.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've been wondering where the arts fit into the cognitive niche. You have recently been very complimentary about Dennis Dutton's book, The Art Instinct. And, you know, I mean, intelligence is one thing, but what about the pre-modern arts? Didn't they really help us to survive and in our reproductive survival in the context of ritual? Where does that fit in? It's just not being mentioned, the arts.
Yes, well, I think the answer may depend on what art form one's talking about. I think in the case of narrative fiction, there is a plausible role for that as a part of the cognitive niche. Namely, you are engaged in what artificial intelligence researchers call case-based reasoning. That is, setting up a plausible scenario that obeys the most or all of the causal laws of reality, putting a protagonist in that hypothetical world and playing out the consequences. And so creating and understanding narrative fiction is a way of multiplying the space of possible experiences that you could explore and hence anticipate courses of action to cope with. For other forms of art, I think the answer is less clear, and I suspect that many aspects of art may not be adaptations in the biologist sense of enhancing reproductive fitness, but some of them may simply be byproducts of the fact that there are patterns of stimulation that give us pleasure for adaptive reasons, and that as a technological species, we can bring about things that give us pleasure, including the creation of visual and auditory patterns that are pleasing to us. And given that combination of sources of pleasure and technological know-how, we can play a little bit of a trick on evolution and do things that press our pleasure buttons that may not be adaptive in the strict sense of the evolutionary biologist. Now, I would not insist that all forms of art other than narrative fiction are simple pleasure technologies, but I suspect that a lot of them are, and it would be an empirical question whether particular art forms satisfy the criteria of design for some adaptation as established by some independent benchmark. That is, the reason I mention case-based reasoning in artificial intelligence is that it's a way of elevating a hypothesis about the function of art from a post hoc justification to something for which we have independent reason to believe would be useful to an intelligent agent. And I think for a form of art to be justified as an adaptation, it has to meet some benchmark that we can establish independently of our knowledge that people like art, people like music, people like dance, and so on. I tend to take a more skeptical view than most evolutionary psychologists and indeed most people in the arts about the evolutionary function of the arts, and I think that the simplest hypothesis that many forms of art are pleasure technologies rather than adaptations has not been successfully addressed in most adaptive theories.
Okay, I can take one more question.
Well, this is actually a related question to that last one, and I think I'm an artist, and coming to the question of adaptations of the arts, one of the fundamental questions I find is the notion of intelligence. It seems that in so many of these studies, intelligence is measured in terms of linguistics or abstract reasoning and mathematical terminology, and sort of sidelining the idea of visual spatial intelligence and visualization and imagination. And those things are different kinds of intelligence and physical, manual intelligence that is actually highly adaptable. And it seems like there's sort of a missing gap in terms of the studies or in terms of some of the.
Yes. Well, I think it's crucial I think a lot of the debate on the biology of art, I think, mixes together two sets of criteria. One of them is what do we find praiseworthy, valuable, salubrious, worthy of encouragement and celebration, healthy to be a well-rounded human being. All of our criteria of moral and aesthetic evaluation. And on the other hand, the sense of adaptation in the biologist sense of a design feature that would have led to more surviving offspring in the kind of environment in which we evolved. And because the word adaptive has these two senses, a vernacular sense and a technical sense, it's easy to run them together. And I find that even though it's often evolutionary psychologists who are accused of accepting post hoc just so stories for adaptive function too easily, in my experience, it's actually more often defenders of the arts and people in artistic and literary analysis who are the most adamant adaptationists, I think, because of this confusion of two different senses of adaptation. That is, if you, like me, suspect that certain forms of art are not adaptive, it's almost tantamount in their minds to saying that it is not worthy, it's not valuable, it's not something that we ought to support and praise. And I think that's an error. Applied to the concept of intelligence, there are clearly forms of intelligence that are in many senses as worthy as spatial and logical and mathematical reasoning. But from the point of view of what good does intelligence do an organism over the course of evolution, there's a clear sense in which spatial intelligence and verbal intelligence and even numerical intelligence can lead to concrete payoffs in fitness. If two bears go into a cave and one comes out, should I go into the cave? Being able to do that arithmetic brings tangible benefits. Likewise, having enough intuitive versions of physics and chemistry and biology for it to occur to you to dip a spear point in a secretion of a gland from some poisonous toad can lead to real payoff benefits. The kind of creativity that leads to great works of art, though it's absolutely praiseworthy by our standards of value and worth, that's different from saying that it's obvious why it would have been selected for. Now, maybe it would be that kind of intelligence would have been selected for, but you need a much more complicated and less obvious explanation, which is why I've distinguished it from the more conventional kinds of intelligence.
All right, I'm sorry we have to stop here, otherwise you're going to go way into the night. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks very much.